such a time as this.
And welcome back to For Such a Time as This, the place where there is no such thing as a silent witness. Want to encourage you, as always, go to our webpage for such a time as this dot today. For such a time as this dot today, it is there that you can always be up to date on our newest, how shall I say, material. And Big Brother, who I just found out removed another one of our videos. Uh, you can always find our videos there. We're also on other platforms in which you can always see all the material that we produce here at the channel at For Such a Time as This as our programs continue to expand. I want to use as a text going forward Psalms 1:1. This is how the book of Psalms starts off. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, who walks not in the counsel of the wicked. And with that, I have with me co-host of the Brothers Bell, Jack
Yep.
Zumo. I didn't forget your name, Jack. I hit the wrong button. I wanted to bring in the Brothers Bell icon up there in the corner. Jack Zumo. Jack, that verse, we were speaking on the phone, and that verse just rang out to you. Jack, what does that mean?
Yeah, so not walking in the counsel of the wicked, who does the Christian go to as their source of wisdom and information
Yeah,
and counsel of how to interpret this life?
yeah,
It's not to people who are wicked, but it's to those who are informed by, and the Psalms continues, who are informed by the word of God.
should be correct. And now we have an issue going on here. Wickedness. Take it away.
Yeah, so when I shot you a call last night, I had just come across information of really a scandal that had happened in the 80s and 90s. In the 80s and 90s, that was when the AIDS, the HIV epidemic was really wide blown. And one of the great concerns of the epidemic was that we had no treatments available for it. It was many years before we actually had effective treatments for it. What I found out last night was that there was experimental testing, clinical trials done among a variety of people throughout the country during these decades. But one segment of the population particularly caught my eye of who was tested, and that was foster children. Part of the clinical trials in the 80s and the 90s was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of foster children. That's that's across several states, upwards of seven. That's in New York, that's in Illinois. This is happening in Texas as well, where the government agencies, researchers, and scientists would go in and get permission of a single government agency to get access to hundreds of foster kids for the testing purposes.
Hundreds of foster kids for testing purposes as it related to the AIDS epidemic, right? Back in the 80s.
Right. So trying to
Okay.
find some kind of treatment for it, and
Yeah.
they would be given a series of cocktails of drugs with significant side effects.
And then
It turns
so,
out years
I'm sorry, go ahead.
good.
And then
Well,
so
so
trying to do trials for AIDS vaccine or a cure for AIDS, they didn't use rats or pigs. They used human children that were in the foster system. Am I understanding that correct?
yeah, and it's not the children involved in the study. They're not isolated to the foster care system. There
Oh, okay.
were children not in foster care who were also involved in some of the clinical trials. The problem is with foster care children, they're particularly vulnerable because they don't have those family structures to help guard them and guide them through those decisions.
Hmm.
So children as young as 5 years old in the foster care system who really aren't able to make those decisions for themselves were being guided by bureaucrats from afar who don't have the intimate knowledge of the child like a parent would to make those decisions. And so one of the ways that the program was sold to the foster care agencies was that each foster child will have an independent monitor, somebody who's not attached to the organization, the foster care organization, and who has also medical experience to monitor and care and think about the well-being of the child solely. Problem is, that didn't happen with regularity. In Illinois, when it happened to foster care children, no advocates were found. In New York, where many hundreds of children were gone through this process, less than a third of them had these independent monitors. So where you would have maybe a family in dire straits with a child with a disease, you could maybe see them doing some kind of experimental trials to try and help the child. At least there, that's a decision that a family with the structures in place to protect the child can make and monitor closely and pull the plug on the trial at the slightest sign of anything going awry. That doesn't happen for foster children, though,
It doesn't.
because there's so many of them, and the system can be so overloaded. And we're talking about the 80s and 90s, when a lot of the things that are in place today were not in place, not to protect them.
Yeah, but
The monitors they're supposed to have, they weren't even there.
yeah, but this first video that we had, and you know what? I did look it up. I forgot to tell you, this documentary was done by the BBC documentary department. So this is from the BBC. This video, but there are some things that happen that will seem to be more insidious than that. In that this first video clip that we have was from a mother who was HIV positive with her child, HIV positive, and they went to her and asked her to be part of this trial. And like you said, this safeguard was in place, and the mother said no. Boy, and that did not go well. Let me play this first clip. Here it is.
My daughter told me, she said when she went to see the doctor, at that time it was the child's appointment. The man said they will be giving her $25 for a month if they can put the child on experimental basis. She said, I will think about it. And she said no. Then the doctor told her, he said, you will regret it.
Regina's daughter took Garfield off all medication. Almost immediately, his health improved. Then there was a knock on the door.
They came to take the child. And they came with police. I think it was 3 to 4 police then.
In New York, you don't need a court order to take a child from its parents. The Administration for Children's Services, or ACS, has exceptionally strong legal powers to decide what's best for the city's kids.
They're essentially out of control. I've had many ACS caseworkers tell me, we're ACS, we can do whatever we want, and they usually get away with it.
So there you had a mother whose child she said no. And for those in Illinois, that would be the DCFS, I guess, the ACS. They came and took the child. What country do we live in? I mean, how is that
there are
possible?
some emergency situations where you would maybe not be able to get to a judge to have a judge or something like that sign off on it. And at least in Illinois, there is an adjudication process where it does eventually, in a short amount of time, it has to come before a judge to be decided.
Sure.
But over a medical issue seems a bit much, particularly experimental. So that's really the problem, right? So it's experimental drugs.
Yeah.
And these are powerful drugs and powerful drug cocktails. Some of them seem to have eventually been approved for use for children. Some of them were not. And the side effects are pretty rough for, think of how young they could be, 5 and younger. Rashes, vomiting, toxicity in the blood, losing ability to walk, diarrhea, great weight loss, apathy, these sorts of things.
Yeah, and that's the perfect tee up for the second part of this video that's right after this, in that, like you said, you take the child, but then you have to go towards or go before a judge. But I think maybe they target these poor families who don't have the resources nor the will to fight the government. And look at what happened, at least in this case. Look what happened.
Garfield simply disappeared into the system. one of 23,000 children placed either with foster parents or in children's homes. This Catholic-run home, the Incarnation Children's Centre in Harlem, is where many HIV children end up if their parents or guardians refuse to medicate them. For years, it was the centre of highly controversial and secretive drug trials on orphans and foster children as young as 3 months old.
At the time, it did not occur to me that anything was wrong, because we were told by the doctors that these were all steps that were going to happen, to be expected, because they were all HIV positive.
Jacqueline Hoorger is a pediatric nurse who worked at Incarnation for 5 years.
If they were vomiting, if they lost their ability to walk, if they were having diarrhea, if they were dying, then all of this was because of their HIV infection, and to be expected, and that we were doing the best we could to save them from that.
So they lied to this nurse and said that, because of HIV, and if you look at the clip, we'll put it in the video, they were experimenting on these children. And that's why they were vomiting and losing the ability to walk.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable. Go ahead.
There were even reports of children who may have tried to refuse. They were forced the drugs into their system through tubes. So there were many reports. A lot of stuff was breaking in the early 2000s about what happened in the 80s and 90s and into the early 2000s about these agencies. So the Associated Press, a reputable news source, was breaking the stories carried by CBS, NBC, BBC. The stuff that is being documented, it happened.
It happened.
But how far that rabbit trail goes, we don't know. So when New York, for example, where there were 500, 600 kids involved in this over the years, when New York was confronted with this, they hired an organization to do supposedly an independent study. Vera, you can get it online. It's a Vera study. The full study is like 500 pages. Mm-hmm. The problem is the Child Protective Services in New York did not give up to that independent investigation firm everything they needed. So they were stonewalled on names of children to interview. They couldn't interview children or family members. They had very limited access to medical records. So some of the more serious allegations that Vera couldn't substantiate was the deaths of the children in the care. How many deaths were caused from some of the treatments or not, lingering side effects long term. Some really bad stuff that this independent commission could not verify, and they acknowledged that they were very restricted in what they could do, even though they came up with a lot of good information. One piece of information that Vera did confirm, and some of the other news organizations, that one of the government agencies that was involved was the National Institute for Health, and that's an agency that's NIH. Mm-hmm. That organization is comprised of a few dozen other organizations with acronyms. One of the organizations that was directly involved in funding and researching some of these clinical trials and experiments on foster children was the NIAID. That's the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Disease. That agency matters to us now. And so what happened in the 80s and 90s matters to us now, because the man in charge of that agency was Dr. Fauci.
Dr. Fauci.
1986. From 1986 to present, Dr. Tony Fauci was the director of that agency. And it seems like there were two agencies involved from the NIH, his agency and another, directly into funding and researching and putting forth scientists into the testing for all those chemicals and toxic drugs for the children.
So what you're saying is, back in the 80s, the BBC did a documentary in which the NIAID, right? Is that right? The acronym? The NIAID, they were caught up in a scandal and doing trials on humans as it pertained to the AIDS epidemic. And they were doing trials, sometimes, at least in this one case, against the mothers and grandmothers' will. So that agency that was caught up in the scandal back in the 80s, the director of that agency is none other than Dr. Fauci, who is doing it again on a mass scale. And we got to be careful because he's some have claimed that he's doing it again today. Same man, right? Same man doing these trials again. And it's not just with this. Let me play this last clip we have here. Tucker Carlson actually did a story on this. Here we go.
University of Pittsburgh, they were doing a study where they were taking the scalps of 5-month-old aborted babies and they were grafting them onto lab rats and lab mice to see how much longer they could keep them growing for. And you can actually see the photographs in the published study of little baby scalps grafted onto the backs of lab rats growing little baby hairs. Those would have been the little hairs growing on the heads of little infants in Pittsburgh if they hadn't been killed by abortion and then stitched onto lab rats for experimentation. This study was funded by multiple grants from the NIAID office, which is run by Dr. Anthony Fauci. And when I was undercover, Planned Parenthood abortion providers told me that they were the ones who were supplying the aborted baby body parts for experiments at the University of Pittsburgh.
It's one of those stories we almost hesitated to do because it is so grotesque, but it seemed like in the public interest to tell the truth about what's happening. Has Fauci accounted for this?
No, and Dr. Anthony Fauci owns every bit of this study because as the head of, and owns every bit of this issue because as the head of the NIAID office, the buck stops with him in terms of how those grants are spent, whether they're being monitored and made sure that they're ethically and legally and just compliant as far as good stewardship of taxpayer money. The fact that they were using scalps from 5-month-old aborted babies, that means that the heads of those children probably needed to be intact in order to get the scalps, which is an indication that those are either partial birth abortion or even infants delivered alive and whole. Did anybody at Dr. Fauci's office ever ask the researchers at Pittsburgh, hey, how are you getting those scalps? How are you getting whole scalps from the heads of fetuses without a partial birth abortion? I think that Dr. Fauci should be brought in front of the Senate or in front of the United States Congress and ask those questions directly about what his office did to make sure that these grants and that these barbaric experiments were in compliance with all the applicable federal laws and regulations for those federal taxpayer grants.
So there you go. There you go. Fauci is at least implicated in another horrific incident when it comes to research and experimental drugs dealing with humans. Fetuses, that's a made-up term. Humans, they're babies. Jack, what do you make of this, man? I mean...
So with Fauci, at least, we now have a track record, and you know, this is just scratching the surface. This is just stuff that you can just do a quick Google search and just find information about, right?
Yeah, we're not breaking news. We're not breaking any news here, right?
No, we're just reminding people.
That's all,
right?
That's all.
Just reminding people.
Yeah.
So what happens if you actually scratch the surface?
Yeah.
If you don't just look at the surface. So this is just looking at the surface. What happens if you actually dig a little bit to see how far that rabbit trail grows for Fauci and company?
Wow. I mean, how much has this guy done? I mean, what has he done?
And the oversight. I mean,
there is none. It seems to be none. So
one of the problems, if you have a researcher like Fauci, so he's not a practicing physician, though he has the title doctor.
Yeah.
He's a researcher. He's a scientist. When you have these sorts of men, and they have a track record of questionable ethics at the very least, right? Through the decades, and they are never stopped. They never brought to account. They have no reason to turn course and start doing the research in science with ethics, right?
Yeah.
So they've gone from bad to worse, and that's a problem. Ethics is a problem if it's not followed, if the ethics are not properly informed.
Yeah. And this was the man who was on television every day, still on television a lot, lecturing the country on what we should be doing when it comes to health nationwide. Unbelievable.
And it hasn't stopped. So it seems like his one of his overarching ethical beliefs is the ends justify the means.
Yep.
That's terrible for researchers and scientists.
Yep.
The ends cannot justify
Yep.
be a guiding principle.
It sounds like 1930s Germany to me.
Yes,
Jack.
all these. Yes.
It's. I mean, we can look on the pictures and we can look back in history and we can shake and wag our heads and fingers at them. But how is this any different? How is this any different?
It's the tyranny of the supposed experts, where we give off all our liberties and all of our trust into the hands of supposed experts.
Yeah.
And we are then ruled by them, men with bad and questionable ethics. Even today, I mean, you can look at the past year and see the ways that Fauci has contradicted himself.
Yeah.
Before he said this, but now he's saying this. Before what's guiding him?
Yeah.
His bad moral code, his bad ethics.
And as it pertains to Christians, I'll put it up again. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked. The wicked seems to be one Anthony Fauci, and I would say Christians don't listen to him. He clearly seems to be, to me, he has a track record. I mean, these BBC did a scandal on this long before the Wuhan virus, but the man continues to be implicated in a lot of unethical things when it comes to research. Jack, I'll give you the last word.
Well, I think you said it pretty well. Christians and anyone, we do not follow unrighteous people.
Yes.
We want to follow people who are guided by the Word of God, who are the proper ethical resource from God. And that is from Christians to non-Christians, because when the righteous rule, the people rejoice.
Yes. Thank you very much for being with us again here for such a time as this, where we will try our best to always give you the world and what's going on through a biblical lens. Thank you, and God bless. Until next time.
For such a time as this.